Okay, so what I actually want to talk about today is how do we build community? So Elixirbridge started a few years ago because we were interested in, we had done some work, and I'll talk a little bit about this, with another organization called Railsbridge that puts on free workshops for underrepresented folks in tech to learn Ruby on Rails, and we wanted to do something similar. I was afraid that was going to happen, for the Elixir community. And when we started thinking about that, we're like, well, how do we do this? Like, how do we effectively do this? Where do we start? And so before we actually talk about Elixirbridge specifically, oh no, it's not doing what I want. Sorry, folks, 1 second. Very strange. I might have to do this without my notes. You all will have to bear with me. There we go. But before we started actually doing anything, we're like, where do we start, right? Why are some communities really awesome? I spent a lot of time in the Ruby community, and it was great. And why are some communities toxic? And people consistently talk about the problems that exist in those communities. And as we were starting, we're like, well, we kind of want to understand where we currently are. Like, why is the community currently the way it is? Not that it's bad, but how do we understand it so that we can help figure out a way to make it even better? And as I was researching this talk, I read an article that I'm going to share in a second, a couple quotes from in a second, about kind of the state of technology and where it's come from, like, the early 80s to now. And I kind of want to start with, just to level the playing field, how might we define community, right? And I think this resonates with all of us. A feeling of fellowship as the result of common interests. That's one of the reasons we're all here. We're all interested in Elixir, we're all at this conference. But the person who wrote this article, this was in Wired a few months ago, said this, and I thought this really resonated with me. So much about building software, more than anything anyone wants to admit, is etiquette. It's rules all the way down, right? Coders care passionately about positions of brackets and semicolons. And like us, they meet at conferences and on message boards and in private Slacks to hash out what's good and what is bad. But I want to come back to this idea of etiquette. And if we think about it and look at what that means, it's a customary code of polite behavior. It's a customary code. We're essentially making it up, right? We're making up the rules as we go, deciding what works, what doesn't, what's good and what's bad. But what that inherently means is that whether we want to or not, sometimes we're deciding who is in and who is out, who has the privilege and access to be there, to participate, to understand the etiquette, and who doesn't. So we began thinking in the context of community building, who actually feels welcome? And I'm sure this isn't uncommon, right? Who in this room has ever felt unwelcome in some space? Right? And thinking about what that feels like. And it's funny because as an industry, we're constantly talking about progress and innovation and new ideas and how to make technology better using technology. I repeated myself. It's okay. But we haven't solved this problem. So many people still feel unwelcome. 2 years ago, in a nonprofit in Oakland, the Kapoor Center put out a study. It was called the Tech Leavers Study. And they were looking at why people are leaving the industry. And it's not surprising, right? We're all familiar with like the Google manifesto and Uber and the continuous scandals. Almost 40% of people are leaving because they don't feel welcome. Yep, Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is looking at why people are leaving the industry. And I wanted to bring up this point. Is anybody familiar with this term? It's called status distance. So this came out of some research I was doing as I was writing this talk. There's a paper published by two professors at Columbia University at the School of Business, Catherine Phillips and Melissa Thomas Hunt. And they essentially looked at this concept of status distance in groups. So when you have a group of people, each person in the group is essentially kind of inherently assigned a value. And it might be because of their position, like if folks are in a meeting and they have a title that's superior to other people. But it's also because of a lot of other factors that are less obvious. Like if most of the people in the meeting are from a dominant group, like a dominant group that's represented in the industry, they essentially, each of those people have more value. And so people in the group that have less value, and often the folks that are underrepresented, they have a farther, the status distance between the people who have a lot of value and a little bit of value is far. And so oftentimes, even though those people that have perceived less value have really good opinions and really unique perspectives and valuable things to say, they don't feel as confident about asserting their ideas, and their ideas are often not incorporated into the outcome of the group. It's interesting study, but it's really another way of saying bias, right? That oftentimes those kinds of groups can lead towards bias. And it a little bit has to do with how we process information as humans. Anybody heard of this, fluency heuristic? Right, so essentially the idea here is that the easier it is for us to process something, the more value we place on it. So if we're surrounded by people that have similar ideas that we can understand easily, we place value on that. But if somebody comes in and has different ideas and different perspectives, but they're harder for us to understand, we may inherently give that less value, even though what they're bringing to the table is really valuable. In the process of thinking about some of this stuff, I was reading another study by the Harvard Business Review, and they took a look at a company, and they were taking a look at why but they were specifically looking at men and women, not that those are the only groups to look at, right? They're looking at men and women, and why women weren't as present in higher level management at this company. Were they doing something differently? And they actually had this woman wear sensors, and were collecting data, not specific communication data, but metadata about their communication patterns, how much of the time they spent focused on work, how much of the time they spent interacting with others and their superiors, et cetera. And the idea here is that what they concluded was actually there was no difference between what they were doing and their male counterparts were doing. But they were being perceived as different. It's the perception of their work that was leading to the problem, not them themselves. And so to bring this back to kind of what we're talking about today, right, this idea of building community. The people that already have the bias lean towards them, right, the people that already are in, that already have the understanding, we are the ones, right, that have the responsibility to help others get that same access and feel that same empowerment and to be aware. And how do you do that, right? How do you make people feel welcome? This is something that we talked about a lot as we were starting Elixirbridge. We'd had some experience with organizations, but how do we really bring people in and make them feel welcome and empowered so that they can actually do things and feel effective in the community? And I was just on Twitter the other day, and one of my favorite people that I follow was saying, another person was saying, I'm done, I'm leaving the industry because I don't like the way I'm being treated. And again, we talk about progress, but how do we make better progress here? And going back to this article that I was reading, I really like his definition, right? Progress is really the opening of doors and the leveling of opportunity. It's seeing calmly, accepting, and thinking of others, right? And I love this. If Bitcoin can be real money, then fairness can be a real goal. So what do we mean by fairness? Again, providing an environment for folks to enter and to feel welcome and to have the tools to effectively participate in community. So then this does bring us to Elixirbridge. But before I get into exactly what we did, I want to give credit to the fact that a lot of what we did was actually started by an organization called Railsbridge. Anybody familiar? Somebody is. A bunch of you, right? So for those of you that are not, right, started by two women, Sarah Allen and Sarah May in 2009. They were tired of being the only women in their tech meetup. They're like, what if we get 20 women into a room, teach them Ruby on Rails? They ended up getting 60. This is 2009, Rails was really hot. And they kept doing it over and over and over again. And since then, they've had hundreds of workshops run by all volunteers, all free, all over the world. And I think this is pretty remarkable. They helped the community go from 2% women to 18% women in 1 year. We haven't quite accomplished those stats with Elixirbridge, but we're working on it, right? So far, we've started with a similar goal, right? We want to help not just women, but underrepresented folks in tech learn Elixir and Phoenix via free workshops that we hold, all run by volunteers. And we've had workshops all over the country, and we may have one in London soon. And generally, the setup is the same. Students will come in, just to give you a little background, they'll self-select into a classroom based on their perceived skill level of themselves. They'll have a teacher and a couple of teaching assistants in the room. They will go through the curriculum that we wrote as a group together. And then at the end of the day, we'll do a retrospective with students and teachers separately so we can get some real feedback on how the day went and how to make it better. And then oftentimes we'll try and have some kind of event afterwards, a happy hour or something, so students and teachers and people can connect outside of the classroom. So what has worked? We'll talk about what's worked, and then we'll talk about what we haven't done well. So we talk about creating a welcoming, inclusive environment. It's one of our main tenets. You'll hear me say that a lot. But how? Well, we want a safe space. And of course, we start with a code of conduct. You hear a lot of organizations talk about this, and it's important, right? Ours holds several tenets in play. We want our community to be reflective of the diversity of the general population. We're committed to a harassment-free experience for everyone. We believe that everyone has something to contribute, and that anybody is allowed to hold a workshop. But it's not just enough to have one of these, right? Unless it's really clear what is expected by it, and it's really clear what happens when something goes wrong, it's just a tool, but the tool is useless if people don't know what to do with it. So in ours, we try to have really clear examples of what is expected. And a lot of what you're going to hear me say is going to sound really obvious, but unfortunately it's not, right? Some of the things we say are like, in the code of conduct, use your words, respect boundaries. If you feel like if you're working with somebody and if you feel like you need to write or use their machine, ask them first. Don't ask anybody out on a date. Again, all of these things seem really obvious, but they're not, because these problems have happened. We even try and make the gray area, because there's always gray area in these things, as clear as we can, right? We say things like, if you think your behavior is going to be inappropriate, it probably is, so don't do that thing that you think is going to be inappropriate. And remind people that each person gets to define what their normal is. And don't assume that your way of thinking is the norm. And sometimes it's not clear, right? Good conduct requires good judgment, and sometimes there's a fine line between what's warm and acceptable and unacceptable. But small things, like if you just met somebody and you think they're awesome, like people meet at a workshop, and they want to go work on a project together, we suggest give somebody your contact info instead of asking them theirs. It seems small, right? But again, it's being aware of their boundaries and being aware of their level of safety and comfort. And again, the reason that we do this is back to etiquette. We want to make sure that everyone's working with the same rules. Everyone's on the same playing field. But things go wrong, right? We can't catch everything. Everyone's familiar with garbage fires. And so the most important thing is that people actually have the agency to do something when something does go wrong. At the beginning of our workshops, we point out who the people are to talk to. So if something goes wrong and someone has made you feel uncomfortable, talk to these people. And for the people that volunteer, we make sure that they know exactly what to do if something happens, right? Whether it's making sure that the person who has had something happen feels safe and they need a separate space, or to call someone to meet them, right? Or help them document what happened so that we can escalate it up our channels effectively, documented in writing, oftentimes. And then on the other hand, how do you deal with the person that's being difficult? Is it removing them from the workshop? Is it removing them from the building? If it's really intensified, do you actually have to call the police? And are they prepared to do so? And how would they do that? And so having people be prepared to actually do something if something goes wrong has proven very effective. One of the other tenets that we hold is that everybody has limited knowledge but infinite potential. And this seems, again, obvious, but it's really key to keeping the intimidation factor low. People come in, and we don't actually have any expectations. They're really just there to learn. And if they don't have to worry about knowing, it makes it a lot easier for them to focus on learning, and a lot easier for them to feel comfortable participating. And the reason we try to do this, right, we teach people to code because we believe that the people making technology should accurately reflect the diversity of those using it. And we know that, right? The more people that we bring in, the more diverse our community is. That essentially creates more opportunities for the community as a whole, and we all benefit. But in order to do that, things need to be accessible. And I tell this story about, I gave a talk a few years ago at ElixirConf, or Codebeam in San Francisco, and it was about how Elixir essentially makes us better developers. Elixir, as a language, allows us to use patterns that allow us to write better code. And Dave Thomas was in the audience, and the late Joe Armstrong was in the audience. And at the end of the talk, they started arguing. And Joe Armstrong essentially said, who cares if it's hard, as long as the end result is beautiful? And Dave Thomas said, wait, but it needs to be accessible, otherwise no one's actually going to use it. And so that's why one of the things that we have thought a lot about is accessibility, right? So our workshops are free. We offer food. We offer childcare so that folks can come even if they have kids. We tend to have them on the weekends so it doesn't get in conflict with other people's work. And we help people get their systems set up because everybody knows every time you have to set up your systems, that is really painful. I just did it with this new machine. It's always annoying. Our curriculum is open source, right? Anybody can have access to it. And at the beginning of each workshop, we do a series of introductions, right? Everyone introduces a little bit about themselves and why they're there. And again, that's to lower the intimidation factor. So people in the room don't feel like they're the only one there that doesn't know a thing. It's to help build this sense of community. Because when people feel comfortable, what we've noticed is they're that much more excited to engage and to come back. The other thing is resources, right? We mentioned our curriculum is open source. So that's one piece. But with regards to our teachers, right? Like just because somebody is a really good software developer doesn't mean that they're going to be the best teacher. It also doesn't mean that they necessarily understand how to deal with conflict resolution, which does happen. So we're working on some material right now to help train our teachers to be prepared to deal with conflict resolution, but also if they want to help them be better teachers. And when this works, when we've seen this work, when teachers are able to effectively teach and able to effectively create this feeling of safety in a classroom, we actually get this thing happen, which we've kind of called a community of practice. We all know that like building software is really just about a bunch of people coming together that have an in-depth understanding of something. And they're able to communicate and collaborate effectively to bring something to life. And we're essentially modeling that pattern in our workshops. So not only do students get to learn something, but we're trying to model what like healthy, positive software development looks like. And we've seen some volunteers take some of these practices back to their offices. So it spreads beyond just the workshop. And students are learning from volunteers, and volunteers are learning from students. And so it feels like the knowledge is being built together rather than just one direction. And we focus a lot on reminding people, right? We don't see this a lot in the industry or at work, right? But it's okay not to know. And we try and model that. We have TAs who will ask questions if the students aren't asking questions, reminding the students that there are no wrong questions, and modeling this behavior, because if folks don't feel comfortable and they're not learning, then we're not doing our job. And again, these things seem small, but getting them to actually happen and seeing them in practice has been really effective. And it works. Folks have come to us and told us that they've had really comfortable sharing and learning. They've come back, they started as students not knowing really anything and have progressed and come back as teachers. They've helped us write curriculum. And from a workshop standpoint, it's been going pretty well. We've had successful workshops, we've had students come back, we've had students feel like, oh, I can participate, this community feels like a place that I can be. But there's a lot we've gotten wrong. Who else in here runs or does something with an open source project? Anybody? So you all know, right? Open source is really hard. So the things we've gotten wrong, we don't necessarily have answers to, so I'd love to hear from you, right? We're all volunteer run. We only run as many workshops as we have people to run them. And right now, it's just like 3 of us running these workshops. And we've learned, like theoretically anybody can run a workshop, the curriculum is open source. But we need to have a lot of documentation and infrastructure in place for somebody to feel comfortable doing that. And we've been so focused on having the workshops that we haven't put together a lot of these resources to help empower other people to actually do this, like having a runbook in place that tells people what they need to do. Another thing that we've learned is people want that in-person contact before they want to start something new. So providing that in-person support, not necessarily directly in person, but on a call, and walking people through the things that they're doing so that they can feel comfortable doing it themselves. Also, as you all know, people or writers are in the audience, writing curriculum is really hard. And I don't know that we've gotten it exactly right. We've started, but when you're writing curriculum, who is it for? And how much of it are you writing as like, this is a curriculum someone's going to go through by themselves versus going through it as a group? And how much time do you give people to try and figure things out on their own versus explaining things to them? How do you write the curriculum in a way that it's consistently challenging so that they can keep coming back and learning new things? And at the end, how do you make it relevant? How do you make it so that they're also building something useful at the same time? So it's not just something that's out of arbitrary context that won't be useful when they're trying to do the next thing. And maintaining it is even harder, right? We all know this. Bug fixes, using the latest features of the language, et cetera, adding new curriculum. A lot of these things we didn't think about when we started. We're like, this is going to be great. We want to help. We think we can do this. We think we can bring people together. But thinking about the actual running of the organization and not just the day-to-day workshops is something that we haven't done as good a job of, and something that we're thinking about now. Because it turns out you'll need help, right? At the end of the day, you can't do all the things yourself. But in order to get the help, you actually need to break down the pieces of work that you need help with in a way that are really specific. If you're like, there's so many things to do, and someone's like, I want to help, and you're like, cool, can you do this thing? But if it's not broken down really specifically, exactly the thing that needs to be done, it's really hard for people to contribute. Whether it's just like bug fixes or writing curriculum or helping organize a workshop, what are the specific things that need to be done, and where can people who want to help actually insert themselves and providing those opportunities so that people can take advantage of them? And scaling is hard, right? Not just in software, but in any organization, right? As we're trying to have more workshops, as we're trying to bring more people in, right now we're trying to figure out a way how we can create a training that can help other people who want to organize feel comfortable just doing that themselves. So having the right pieces in place so that people feel ready to do whatever the thing is. And I don't know if people have an answer for this. Burnout is real, right? The three of us have been doing this for a few years and trying to have workshops. Right now we're trying to have them once a month. It's not always as consistent as we like, but if you're someone who's building community and thinking about doing an effort, making sure that it's sustainable, because getting to the point where you're like, wow, we've been doing this for a long time and there's so much to do and now you're tired, it doesn't help the community, it doesn't help you, right? And then the quality of everything that you're doing kind of just gets worse. And I refer to this as, and I wonder if anybody in the audience has answers, we started this as a project with kind of an unforeseeable future, right? We're going to do this thing. And I call it a forever project. But when you're working with something that you're like, I have no idea how long this is going to go, that can feel really daunting. And how do you potentially think about handing pieces of that off to other people or finding the support or finding the people that are interested? That's actually really hard. I don't know if anybody else has had the experience in this, but I've asked around the community and nobody has a good answer for like, how do you manage forever projects well? But despite all that, I think we're continuing doing this work because we have seen the effect that it's had, even though it's small. Elixirbridge is not big. It has on the community, and the positive effects it's had on the people that have attended the workshops. And the thing that I really just want to leave you with is, even if you're somebody who's not going to start an organization or not going to run your own meetup or not going to do anything like that, there are really simple things that we found effective that individuals can do who are interested in helping build this community to be more welcoming, even more welcoming, right, of people. And it's as simple as for those folks that are here at this conference, right, engaging in conversation with somebody you don't know and making them feel welcome. Or thinking about the last 10 people you shared your excitement about Elixir with. And if you think about that right now, are those people reflective of the community that you want to see? And if not, who are the next 10 people that you want to invite in. And reach out to 2 of them. Because we found that sometimes all people really need is to be invited in. That's all I got. Thank you.
We have a few extra minutes for questions, if anyone wants. Yeah.
You haven't always had a lot of help, but is there a ratio that you find? And my name is Bruce. I know that you haven't always had all the volunteer help that you want, but is there a ratio that you find optimal for running your workshops?
For running workshops themselves, yeah, I think if we can have, we try to keep our as far as workshops specifically, we try to keep our classes to 7 to 8 students per class. And so 1 teacher and 2 TAs per 8 students is, I think, a really good ratio of having enough people to help. That seemed to work really well for us. Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to get back to status distance, which you mentioned earlier, in organizations. Do you also see that in these communities where you have, a lot of novice users? And I imagine you do. And how do you kind of reduce that status distance? What are some of the ways that you have found to be successful?
Yeah, totally. I think that's a really good question. A lot of it has to do with part of what we do. We do some teacher training to make sure that our teachers are kind of aware of certain things that they need to be aware of when we do these workshops. And a lot of that is simple things, right? Jargon is a big one, right? Like the way you talk about a particular topic, right? Not having conversations that feel kind of exclusive, right? Because somebody might not understand and then feel intimidated, right? Again, for the people that are there who are comfortable, having conversations with people that are new, right? Making them feel welcome, asking them like how they're doing, how's it going, right? Trying to, as the class is moving forward, trying to elicit the direction it should go in from the students rather than dictating it, right? So like, how's it going? What is interesting to all of you, right? Rather than the teacher determining what they think is important, having the students determine what they think is important as well as what they've currently learned, so that essentially the power of like the day is in the hands of the people who theoretically have less of that status distance. But the students can dictate kind of the direction of what that goes in. And that seems to be really helpful and empowering. Any questions?
Yeah. So speaking about burnout, can you speak more on that and maybe share some of the lessons you've learned and some advice on, keeping that momentum and motivation going with the volunteers that are helping you?
Yeah, burnout's real. It's something I've experienced myself. And the interesting thing, at least, and this is only speaking from my perspective about burnout, is you don't always see it happening when it's happening until you've gotten to the point where you're like really exhausted and you don't really feel like you have the energy to continue doing the thing. Like, where are you going to summon the energy to do the next thing, do the next workshop? Because you have been doing so many things and you've taken on so much and you're so tired. And one of the things that we have tried to do, especially with people that help us, is making sure that, trying to check in with everybody that's working with us, making sure that no one person is doing too many things and doing too many of the same things over and over again, right? So like trying to keep the commitments much lower, right, for people. So having somebody commit to like, I'm gonna do this thing for like 2 months and then reevaluate, right? Rather than in organizations, oftentimes people are like, I'm gonna take on this thing, but there's no definite time frame, and sometimes people have a hard time saying that they don't wanna do something anymore and they can't do it anymore. And so being like, all right, why don't you do this thing for a defined period of time, and we'll check in that defined period of time. And maybe you wanna keep doing it, but also then you can totally safely say, I'm done. And like nobody feels bad. So that's something that's proven really effective.
You mentioned a little bit about at the end of Elixirbridge having sort of a happy hour / kind of feedback to have teachers and students mingle. Have you found a good system of encouraging feedback from those who attend Elixirbridge to the volunteers so you can improve? Is that something that...
Yeah, so I think maybe I didn't make that. So that's kind of what we do. Good question. In our retrospectives, we actually try and separate. We have them separately. Before happy hour, we have them separately with teachers and students so that the students can feel free to be very clear and very vocal about how it went and what could be better without fearing any kind of hurting anybody's feelings. So that they can give feedback on the workshop, but also about the teaching and how it went, et cetera. And then we can relay that back to the teachers.
Hi.
Hi.
I just wanted to ask quickly around when you first kind of set out to do this, how do you kind of, I guess, publicize it or something, or kind of get it out amongst the community and get people involved in actually attending the workshops? Were there specific groups people that you targeted or something, but how to get those people outside of the existing community in?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We did. So, I mean, part of it was because we kind of, we were able to leverage a lot of the Railsbridge infrastructure and their event management system. We were able to reach some people that way, but then we started reaching out to other organizations within our communities. I'm in San Francisco, so through our own networks, we started to reach out to other organizations that we thought that we wanted to partner with, who might be interested. My friend runs a boot camp called Tectonica. As an example, it's for folks who probably couldn't, who are underrepresented, but also probably couldn't otherwise afford a boot camp, but are interested in learning, right? We have a couple other friends that running other organizations that we started reaching out to partner and see if they would be willing to spread the word to their communities.
I've been trying to run some workshops myself, and one of the questions I have is how you structure the workshops in terms of how much programming versus how much presentation, and also do they work individually or do they work collectively? I'm just kind of really interested how you, what you found most effective.
Yeah, and again, this is only from our experience and what we found with the people that we've worked with, because everyone's different. We've found really small groups effective, right? And effective when folks self-select their skill level, and so we can match them in groups based on that. It's not always perfect, so we mentioned to folks during the day, hey, if this isn't right, if it's too fast or too slow, we can put you in a group that is moving faster or more advanced, or a group that is moving slightly differently, so that we try and match on perceived skill level. And then for us, the group kind of goes through the curriculum together. There are moments where there are places in the curriculum where we're explaining, but again, it's something that I was talking about. It's a really hard balance of places where you're explaining, but then also places where students have an opportunity to try and implement something and work together with each other. So it's not as formal instruction. So it's a mix of formal instruction, break, do some of this work, trying to implement something, working together, and then going back to this instruction. And by formal instruction, I mean we're going through the curriculum together. Often I'll have a student who feels comfortable actually be the one going through the curriculum. So we're going at that student's pace and walking through the curriculum. That seems really effective also.
All right, I think that's all the questions we have.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.
All right, give it up for Anne, everyone.